Brandon Seale has spent the last 20 years rambling across South Texas and northern Mexico, installing solar panels, laying pipelines, and occasionally punching cattle. Brandon is the proud father of four and husband of one. His podcast, A New History of Old Texas, has been downloaded more than 500,000 times and may have helped discover the biggest battlefield in Texas history. Folks, Brandon Seale.
Thank you. So my podcast, A New History of Old San Antonio, came out of my struggles to articulate what it is that makes our city so special. An obvious answer is our history, but I think most of us kind of cringe at the idea of being defined by a touristy riverwalk or a crumbling mission or even the Alamo. But there's more to these symbols than we realize. The riverwalk we walk birthed our city, after all. The sacred waters, the spirit waters of the San Antonio River, the Yanaguana, sat at the crossroads of the Mesoamerican, Mississippian, and Plains Indian worlds. In the 1600s, a Native American refugee community formed along its banks, fleeing the dual pressures of epidemic disease and imperial conquest. The Spanish arrived just in time to help host a great native rebirth in the cultural molcajetes that were the San Antonio mission communities. And more so than any other community in North America, perhaps, Native Americans in San Antonio passed their bloodlines into the new settler societies, often hidden behind Hispanic baptismal names, but present in the records nonetheless. From the beginning, it was a mixed community bound together by the shared struggle of the frontier, a struggle shared, by and large, on the backs of a horse, which still plays an outsized role in our symbolism, in our annual celebrations, our ideology, and in the logo of our beloved NBA franchise. But the horse also accelerated the collision of Native American and European empires that were converging on Texas at the time. San Antonio was the most contested point on the continent for much of its early history, but it was also the site of some of the most ambitious Native American peace treaties. From the violence of the past, San Antonians proved to be particularly good at producing a vision for the future. And their vision was built on an ideology of tolerance and toughness, which developed into a tradition of self-government that made space for a caste-defying mix of Native Americans, Spaniards, and a surprisingly large number of Afro-Tejanos, as many as one half of early San Antonians. And it was a tradition of self-government that they were willing to die for. On September 16, 1810, Father Miguel Hidalgo unleashed his grito against 3 centuries of Spanish colonial rule. His army was soon defeated on the battlefield, and so he set himself and his revolution in retreat to San Antonio. He never made it, but his emissaries did. And after a string of victories over Spanish armies, on April 6, 1813, Tejano revolutionaries declared the first independent state of Texas. 4 months later, that republic, and most of the men who declared it, died in the biggest, bloodiest battle in Texas history, the Battle of Medina. Texas was left in ruins. It was the poorest province in Mexico, and that country finally won its independence 8 years later. But San Antonians staked their hopes for recovery on Anglo immigration. Their new vision for Texas was a, quote, mixed society of the American system and the Hispanic customs and traditions, which would represent a triumph of the new world over the tired ideas and prejudices of the old. But San Antonians' ideal of maximizing autonomy while preserving their traditions soon clashed with Anglo ideals that insisted on a clean break from tradition. Even as San Antonio became the largest and most important city in the new republic, English speakers viewed San Antonio's attachment to its past as a mark of its, quote, odd and antiquated foreignness. And I think this is because the American model conceives of identity as unitary, and that all other identities and histories have to be left behind in order to march together triumphantly into the future. Yet San Antonio is and was clearly a part of several different cultural traditions and was and remains defiantly apart from each of them as well. So that even when San Antonio entered the United States, it didn't feel quite American. It was anything but unitary, and its history of epidemic disease and conquest and ethnic cleansing was anything but triumphal. But I think this narrow view of history is part of the reason why Americans are so tied up in knots these days about their past. Many of them are realizing for the first time that their history was never altogether unitary, and that for many, it was anything but triumphal. But I think San Antonio shows a different way to think about it, in the way that we've treated our own history. We'll be the cradle of liberty because we defied Santa Anna in 1836, but we're also going to make sure you know that we're the cradle of liberty because we pronounced for Hidalgo in 1813, because we hosted Francisco Madero in 1910, because we reintegrated our public schools, our lunch counters, and our public transportation before any other city in the state, even as we admit how embarrassingly long it took to do that. We'll let people dress up like old vaqueros and wax poetic about the beautiful game of the winningest franchise in NBA history, and I missed an opportunity to put a Wemby picture up on this one. But we're going to make sure they know that it's all a form of tribute to an old San Antonio form of life that at its best represents an ideal of autonomy within tradition that every dudded up urban cowboy still unconsciously aspires to. And we'll show them that it's never too late to weave the past into the present, not just by putting up plaques on old buildings, but by joining the historic communities that have lived, worshiped, and celebrated on those same grounds since before there were buildings on them, and who still do. And we'll invite them to cook out and to camp out along the same Yanaguana that has hosted this form of sacred celebration, and I do mean sacred, since it was called a mitote. Celebrations of community along the banks of a river that has witnessed the disappearance of innumerable peoples and languages and traditions, and the birth and rebirth of many more. I don't think there's any other city in this country, at least, that can boast the same continuous, unbroken connection to their past that San Antonio can, which makes us the great counterpoint to the American idea that history has to be unitary or triumphal or discarded entirely. And so when demographers say that the future of Texas, that the future of the United States looks like San Antonio, I hear a great spiritual affirmation in that statement, that we were doing it right all along, that we can bring the messy and the tragic past along with us into the future, and that if the rest of this country were to look a little more closely, they'd realize that we've been trying to show them this for quite some time. We are the city, after all, that turned a two-sided tactical miscalculation into the most celebrated defeat in American history. And this is not a country that likes to celebrate defeat, and so they're going to keep trying to ram it into their narrative historical mold, but it's not going to quite work. Because I think what San Antonio history really teaches is that it's not about the tragedy, it's not about the triumph, it's learning the tolerance and the toughness to be able to deal with both. Thank you.